As temperatures plunge, the war in Ukraine is entering a new and brutal phase. Russia's attacks on critical infrastructure amount to weaponizing winter. As Ukrainian civilians shelter in bombed-out houses without power and water, and soldiers in flooded trenches face heavy shelling. What will it take for one side or the other to gain advantage as fighting slows and conditions worsen? We're asking Russia versus Ukraine. Who's better equipped for the winter war? Welcome to the Point. It is a pleasure to greet our guests. Nico Lange is Senior Fellow at the Munich Security Conference and was previously Chief of the Executive Staff at the German Defense Ministry. Also a pleasure to welcome Thomas Wiegold. He is a military expert and a freelance journalist with a popular blog covering security affairs. And joining us virtually from London is Ulrike Franke of the European Council on Foreign Relations, actually currently joining us from France. I'd like to begin, if I may, with you, Thomas. And in history, winter has famously worked to Russia's advantage, helping them repel Napoleon, Hitler. Would you say winter will also help the Russians this time?
Well, I doubt it this time, because we have to see, yes, Russia had an advantage against Napoleon, against the Germans in the Second World War. On the other hand, if you remember the Finnish Winter War in 1939, it was a different story, and the Finns had the advantage because they knew the terrain, they knew winter, they knew how to deal with it. And here we have the Ukrainians who also have an advantage because they know the terrain and they know the situation. So this old equation, Russia knows how to win a winter war, wouldn't necessarily apply at this point.
What are the two key factors? If you had to identify just two, what are the two key factors that essentially decide who has the advantage under harsh conditions?
Well, one obviously is equipment. Who has the better winter kit? We're talking about clothing here, just simple things like cold weather gear, jackets, trousers, all this stuff you can buy. And the other point is something you can't buy, that's morale. The fighting morale of the Ukrainians seems quite different from the Russians, because you have Ukrainian troops fighting for their homeland, while on the other hand you have Russians who have been conscripted partially into this war, who are fighting on a foreign front, who are not fighting for their homeland. And that's quite a difference.
And we want to come back to talk a bit more about morale later on. But Nico, President Putin is warning now that the war could be, I quote, a lengthy process, meaning clearly he's not seeing Russia backing down anytime soon. Does that mean that this winter will simply freeze things in place, literally and figuratively, or could it in fact prove decisive for the outcome?
We are in a lengthy war already, which means that also the industrial aspects of supporting the war become more important, and I think that is what Putin is hinting at. He thinks he can outproduce us. But when it comes to the winter, I personally believe fighting will continue. And the historic pictures we have in mind about winter war, they are not applicable to this war in Ukraine. The Black Sea coast is not Siberia. And even if it is cold, for example, Ukraine has a lot of vehicles on wheels. They will get more mobile when the ground is frozen. So we might even see more activity, because I think Ukraine is trying to use the advantage it has and use the momentum further, even in winter.
Very interesting. Ulrike, if equipment and morale are the two crucial factors, that would seem to favor Ukraine, in fact, as we heard. But is there reason to doubt that that might be the case going forward? Apparently, Russian air transport planes have been seen making repeated trips to China, and there's speculation that they are picking up gear and equipment for Russian soldiers. Could that change the calculus here?
Yeah, it is quite difficult to tell what's going on in Russia there. The situation, of course, is that Ukraine gets a lot of support from the West, and Russia has fewer friends in the world. But we've already seen with support from Iran, Iranian drones and the like, support from North Korea, Belarus, and now potentially China, that this could make a difference. That being said, I think in terms of equipment, as long as the support from the West continues, Ukraine can have an advantage here, but it is overall relatively difficult to tell kind of how deep Russian stocks are and how much they could get from elsewhere.
One thing is certainly clear: conditions will get worse before they get better. Rain and mud will give way to snow and ice, slowing down operations, rendering both soldiers and civilians vulnerable to cold and hunger. Let's take a closer look at what that means for Ukrainian morale so far.
They fight in freezing temperatures. Soldiers on both sides suffer from heavy shelling, while also fighting against hunger, cold, and moisture. The suffering of the civilian population in Ukraine is comparable. They're sheltering in bombed-out houses and apartments, but the will to preserve seems unbroken. It is better to suffer a cold winter, to freeze and starve as long as the Russians aren't here. The Russian bombings often cause water, electric and heating shortages. The enemy wants to use winter against us, to use cold and deprivation as a means of terror. We have to do everything to survive this winter, no matter how hard it will be. The Russian army is still blasting away with all the fighter bombers and helicopters at their disposal. But Western intelligence services predict that winter will bring more quiet to the front, a time for both sides to procure weapons and ammunition for the spring. Who will be more resilient this winter? Russians or Ukrainians?
Let me pass that question directly to Nico, and certainly we heard grit and determination there in those statements from people in Ukraine. But Kiev's mayor has just been warning of an apocalypse if Russian shelling of civilian infrastructure continues as it has. What would that civilian suffering mean for the morale of the troops?
Well, first of all, the resilience of the Ukrainian population is just amazing. It is outstanding. Also, the networks of Ukrainians who are improvising at the moment to sustain the temperatures in the big cities in Ukraine, I think that is a great strength of Ukrainians that also can inspire us. But I think we should take seriously what Vitaly Klitschko is saying, what also the bosses of the Ukrainian energy companies are saying, that the repairs might not be possible quickly, and that there might at least temporarily be the need to evacuate parts of the population, to have them safely there over winter, especially elderly and children. In terms of the front lines, I think it doesn't change much. The Ukrainian armed forces, they are experienced in winter. The war started in winter, we should not forget that. They have built their fortifications. And it seems to me that they are also more disciplined. And winter war, when it comes to soldiers fighting, is very much about discipline, of keeping your dry kit from your wet kit, of having your fortifications clean and without water. And to me, it seems Ukrainians have an advantage there that is also connected to the morale that has been mentioned. And also, I think Ukraine wants to push further this winter. They do not want to lose time. They want to push the Russians out of their territory, so they will use also the winter for that.
Thank you. Ulrike, shelling is far from the only weapon of civilian intimidation that Putin has been deploying. A UN report documents a whole array of war crimes, including torture, rape, abuse of children. What impact is that likely to have on morale in Ukraine? And of course, this isn't new that these tactics are being used. What's the historic record? Do they work as those who deploy them hope?
I think all these atrocities that we're hearing about just reminds Ukrainian soldiers what they're fighting for, that you really cannot leave territory and parts of the Ukrainian population under Russian occupation. So I think in a way it reinforces the will of all Ukrainians to fight. But of course, these are terrible and horrible tactics. We also, this, as you said, this has a long history, and Russia in particular has used these types of weaponizing the winter, the cold, hunger, especially in Ukraine in the past. We know this well. But yeah, overall, it does reinforce, I think, the will to fight. We've just seen in the clip that you showed earlier, this woman who said, we can starve and we can freeze, but as long as we aren't under Russian occupation, we're happy, and this is what we're fighting for. But it depends on how bad it gets and how many people might actually die of cold.
Thomas, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that point. And then also, as well, it's often said that Russia could use the winter pause to regroup and to recuperate from the pretty severe losses that it has seen in recent months. Can Ukraine, do you think, deny it that chance?
Well, they can try. I'm not sure if they really can. Of course, Russia will use any pause in the fighting to beef up its strengths, to transport material, to transport troops. And whether Ukraine really has a chance to deny them that chance, that's not sure yet. On the other hand, we've seen in recent days that Ukraine was able to strike inside Russia, which means there's a shift, still a minor shift, but there might be a shift not in the front line, but in the fighting. So Ukraine might have more chances than it had before.
Let me ask you to talk a little bit more, both of you in the studio, first of all, about those strikes, because they were carried out by drones.
Right. And as far as we know, it's a bit shrouded.
Yeah. Certainly, this is now a full-scale drone war. Is that right?
That's right. We've seen drones in various sizes and in all different tasking, from the cheap stuff you can buy off eBay or whatever, up to old Soviet drones, up to rather modern Iranian drones. So there's the full scale of unmanned warfare introduced in this war.
Ulrike, Ukraine, we think, as we just said, has used drones to strike deep into Russian territory, both military airfields and a refinery. Is that, do you think, likely to provoke escalation on the Russian side? Chancellor Scholz said this week that he actually believes the risk of an escalation and a nuclear strike has decreased. And this is something that is of enormous concern to our viewers, as we can see from some of the comments that are sent into our YouTube site. So I'd be curious about your assessment.
So I think the risk or the fear of an escalation, especially a nuclear escalation, is always there and needs to be taken into consideration. However, first of all, this isn't the first time that Ukraine has struck within Russian territory. Actually, I think in the first month of the war, there was a Ukrainian attack in Russian territory, which didn't lead to that kind of escalation. Now, this attack was closer to the front line than the attacks in recent days, but nevertheless, and similarly, there were the attacks on the bridge to Crimea, where also there was a lot of speculation that this would be the moment where Russia escalates further, and it didn't. It's difficult to tell because in the end, it is Putin who decides whether or not and how to escalate. But I think what Ukraine really wanted to do with these attacks in Russian territory is to send a signal, and a signal to both Russia and the West. The signal to Russia is, of course, if you start a war, you can't, this cannot be cost-free, and you can't expect that this doesn't, influence you as well at home, and we can strike in your territory. So that's an important signal. And the other signal was to the West. The West has been somewhat reticent delivering systems that can strike within Russian territory, exactly because of this fear of escalation. And basically, Ukraine is now showing that they can do it with their own equipment, whether it's old Soviet equipment, as it has been speculated, or newly developed equipment. So there's this kind of signaling in both directions through these attacks. But it is true. Again, we cannot be entirely sure with regard to the fear of escalation. But what we're hearing out of Russia at the moment, I don't think that this type of escalation is imminent.
Nico, who has the advantage in a drone warfare? Is it possible to say, when you look at the two sides, whether one or the other essentially can use this to greater benefit? And second question, EU sanctions are now aiming to choke off Russia's access to drones. Would you expect them to be able to do that?
Well, first of all, I agree with everything that has been said, that drones are omnipresent in this war. And they are very often also used as a support. So it's not only a drone warfare. I think it's a combination of low-tech and high-tech that we are seeing. And even infantry soldiers would not move forward, I think, on both sides without having drones in the air, having reconnaissance about their area. It's difficult to say who has an advantage, but what we have seen is that Ukrainians were able to innovate during the war, to improvise, to come up with new ideas, and that they are very good in using all the digital possibilities that were there to have a better understanding of the situation, and that helped them with shaping their operations. So I would see a little advantage on the Ukrainian side there. I would even extend your point about the sanctions. Both sides are using a lot of civilian drones at the time. I think it would be a bold move to buy off all the civilian drones from the market, to give them to Ukraine so that Russia cannot get them. I mean, that would be the size of the support that is needed. Drone warfare has an aspect, I think, that we also can learn from in NATO. The Ukrainians are able to do things that we are not capable of, and that is also something that should be looked into.
When we look at Ukraine's capacity, Thomas, they actually have been known until now for speed and surprise. We heard Nico say earlier that he doesn't actually see the war slowing down as much as some people seem to predict. I'd be curious whether you would agree with that, or whether you think actually Ukraine will lose some of that advantage that it has in the past.
Well, I do agree. I think the winter will not really have an effect. Of course, winter always slows down operations. Mud and all this stuff will slow down. We will see whether wheeled vehicles will have an advantage when the ground is frozen, how much tracked vehicles will have an impact. Ukraine has both, the Russians have both. Russia has some problems with logistics when roads are closed. So we'll see how this works out. My impression is Ukraine is a bit ahead. On the other hand, Russia has vast stockpiles, not only of ammunition, but also of old materials. So you might say, well, it's an old truck or it's an old tank, but still, if you have thousands of those, quantity is making a difference. I think that's the main point. Ukraine has partially better material, but limited quantities. And that's also a question to the West, how they can replenish those quantities.
Absolutely. And on the subject of, I wanted to go to limited quantities, but in a different area, namely munitions, because you have said, Nico, elsewhere, that the war could come down to a competition over munitions. And we are seeing reports, including from U.S. intelligence, that Russia is facing shortages of ammunition. So would you say that those are confirmed? And how does it play out that some Western countries are also seeing munition shortages, including this one, Germany? What will that do in terms of influencing the fighting?
Putin seems to believe that he can outproduce us. not in all areas, but in the area of artillery ammunition that he is relying on very much. And it is a question whether Ukraine is using the material and the ammunition faster than the partners of Ukraine are producing it. Ukrainian defense industry is destroyed through airstrikes, and it is on us to support Ukraine. And I think even the signal of scaling up production capacities would already send a communication to Putin that we will do whatever is necessary, and he should not calculate that over time he can gain the upper hand again. I think that is very important now. So it's not only the production of the ammunition itself, it's also the communication vis-à-vis Putin. And of course, we have not been ready for a full-scale war in Europe. And stockpiles have not been prepared. I think that's not only true for Germany, I think that's true for many countries. And I think we must just now acknowledge that the idea of producing everything just in time and then bringing it mobilely to places everywhere is not compatible with crisis prevention and with being prepared for a war and disaster. I think that's not only in the military part, that's also in the civilian part.
Yeah, and what that clearly indicates is that Russia's weaponization of harsh winter conditions will pose new demands not only for Ukraine, but also for the Western allies. For now, NATO seems determined to do what it takes. But could that change as Europe faces its own winter challenges?
The Ukrainian soldiers should be well equipped against the cold, with hundreds of thousands of special cold protection jackets, caps, and waterproof boots from German and Canadian inventory. It's a good start, but now what Ukraine needs most are power generators to cover blackouts and to repair equipment for bombed-out power plants. NATO has begun to supply these.
NATO allies are providing unprecedented support. This will fund urgent non-lethal support, including fuel and generators.
Militarily, NATO is focusing its aid on air defense weapon systems. The US and France have promised to send advanced systems to shoot down Russian aircrafts, guided missiles and rockets. In addition, NATO has given Germany clearance to supply the Patriot air defense system to Ukraine. But Germany is hesitating once again. Will NATO be able to help Ukraine through the winter?
And let me pass that question directly on to Ulrike. And Ulrike, Europe, Germany have shown relatively a high degree of public support for Ukraine so far. But could that change if, in fact, the energy crisis worsens here? There's talk of power outages, people facing danger of freezing. Could that change the political will?
It could change the political will, and of course that's what Russia is speculating on. Now, right now, I would like to emphasize that Germany has actually supported Ukraine quite substantially. It was often too slow, or it took quite a lot of discussions before Germany actually did something, which is problematic. But when you look at the numbers and the kind of support that Germany has provided, it actually is very substantial, and we shouldn't forget that. And the support in the German population remains high. Now, of course, you're right, we're only entering winter, and the colder it gets and the more expensive energy becomes, and the more this reaches kind of the German households, support could go down. But right now I'm relatively optimistic that European support is going to hold for the time being.
And Thomas, if I can come to what we heard there in the report about Germany and the Patriots. Germany has, in fact, often been criticized for excessive caution. This is just the latest in a series.
It's wrong at that point.
Yeah, well, that's what I want to ask you, because we heard Secretary General Stoltenberg. He was in Berlin and said, actually, Germany's doing more than many other allies. Why does Germany have such a bad rap?
Well, I think Germany is pretty bad when it comes to communicate what it's doing. We have a weekly list of what has been delivered and what is pledged to Ukraine. And somehow the government is not really outspoken about this. They want to obscure details sometimes, or they claim for security reasons. They could be much more outspoken. I'm not sure what the reason is. Maybe not to to anger Russia or so. But on the other hand, if you see the list, talking about self-propelled howitzers, talking about anti-aircraft cannons, talking about air defense systems, something's happening. So, talking about these Patriot systems, well, Germany has 12 of those, which are integrated into NATO air defense. So it was a pretty bad move from Poland to suggest to hand this over to Ukraine. So this is more Polish-German infighting and not really something to help Ukraine.
Nico, if I come back to our title, Russia versus Ukraine, who is better prepared to hold out during what could be a long winter, what would be your answer?
My answer is Ukraine. But we are not observers in this. Ukraine is better prepared, but it will be able to push further and to drive Russians out if we get the support right.
And will we get it right?
I think the German population would allow the government to do more. And there are always two measurements. Did we do much? Yes, we did do much. But the other measurement is, does Ukraine have what is necessary to militarily win this war? And there we need to do more.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for being with us today, and thank you to our viewers for tuning in. Check out our YouTube channel and tell us what you think about the program. Pleasure to see you. Goodbye.